What if empires don't just conquer land, but also imagination? When we think of imperial power, we think of armies, treaties, invasions, but what if the most powerful weapon of an empire is the story it tells about itself, and the story others repeat? In the late 19th and early 20th century, Japan transformed from a closed island state into an empire, expanding into mainland Asia. Europe observed this transformation with a mixture of fascination and growing unease. Newspapers in Vienna, Berlin, and Paris didn't just report the news. They helped form an image of Japan as a modern, disciplined, civilized power, increasingly comparable to Europe itself. Meanwhile, far away from the Pacific, another region comes into focus: Crimea. Here, debates about meaning and belonging have often been expressed not through politics or conflict, but also through literature, especially poetry. So today we ask a simple question: who creates imperial reality, the empire or the narrative? To explore this question, we went to the annual conference of Eurasian Transformations, where researchers from across Europe examine how Eurasian history isn't just made of facts, but stories that shape facts. We spoke with two scholars whose work connects press history, literature, empire and cultural memory. Christine Frank, on the one hand, a specialist in literature and postdoc researcher, and Larissa Cybenko, a Ukrainian literary scholar and translator. Together, their research shows that imperial narratives can shape the way places are perceived, presenting a small island state as a great power and framing a peninsula through literary images. When we look at Eurasia, we aren't just looking at geography. We are looking at competing imaginations. Let's dive into the world where empire is made of language and where narratives can be as powerful weapons. So, to understand how an empire can change simply by changing its image, we start in Japan. And we start with a researcher who has studied various historical newspaper articles from the Habsburg Empire, tracing how European journalism built the idea of the modern Japanese empire. I asked Christine Frank what led her into this story and what she discovered in the Western press.
I'm a specialist in literary studies. I'm a comparatist. I worked as a professor for German literature at the University of Tokyo for 8 years. And through this period in my life, I got in touch with Japan. I have many Japanese friends, but I was not allowed to acquire language competency. And so I started to listen to the sounds of Tokyo, to listen to everything in my surrounding and to perceive the situation in Japan in a different way.
Listening, rather than speaking, led her to another voice entirely, the historical voice of Europe talking about Japan.
And because I have been working before with the Anno database of the Austrian National Library, which is a very, very interesting database of digitalized historical newspapers, I had the idea, I will screen and analyze all these newspaper reports from Japan in this period to see how Japan is being perceived in the Western and the German and the Austrian public, and how this perception changes during the time.
What Christine Frank found is striking. Japan wasn't simply acknowledged by Europe. It was portrayed in ways that reflected European perspectives and priorities. The European perception of Japan was also influenced by European imperialistic self-perception. After the arrival of the American naval officer Commodore Barry in 1854, European newspapers began reporting more regularly on Japan. Already at this point, many newspapers referred to the country as the Empire of Japan, even though political power still lay with the shogun, the military rulers of Japan, and not with the emperor. Journalists relied on familiar imperial categories. Old terms like Mikado or Deri, historical names for the emperor taken from earlier travel literature, continued to be used, even though the emperor played only a limited political role. Deri refers to the innermost interior of the palace, while Mikado means illustrious gate and refers to the imperial palace. What mattered was less accuracy, but more that Japan would be fitting into familiar European concepts of empire. Throughout the 1850s and 1860s, newspapers presented Japan as an ancient and exotic society, distant, hierarchical, and culturally fascinating, but not yet regarded as part of the European system of great powers. After the restoration of imperial power in 1868, this tone began to shift. By the 1870s and 1880s, newspapers increasingly framed Japan as a state that had opened itself to civilization, adopting European-style institutions, law, and administration. A key moment appears in illustrated newspapers of the 1880s, which praised the Japanese population for embracing reform and portrayed the emperor as a symbol of modernization, even while visual representations still emphasized ritual and hierarchy. This decisive break came with the Russian-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. During the war, European newspapers famously described Japan as the England of East Asia, placing it directly within Europe's own imperial system of comparison. When Japan defeated Russia, a European empire, the press reaction changed abruptly. A European empire lost to a non-European state. Press portrayals increasingly shifted from depictions of an Asian aggressor to those of a noble victor. Japanese generals became aristocrats in the European imagination. Elegant, modern, respectable. Japan was no longer treated as a distant or exotic power, but as a serious imperial actor, one that Europe could not ignore and increasingly sought to engage with.
And then the second step was they had the treaty with Great Britain. This was a very powerful partner behind them, Great Britain against America, against France, and so on. And when they started the Russo-Japanese War, and when they were the winner in this war, everybody in Europe said, well, this is a powerful empire and we cannot neglect them. And then it very quickly, within 1 year, really turned. And they were accepted as a huge power in East Asia.
Japan's victory forced European newspapers to rethink their own narrative about who counted as a great power. Japan's case illustrates how imperial narratives can shift in response to power. As Japan's military and territorial successes grew, European newspapers adjusted their language accordingly. What this case reveals is not just a story about Japan, but a broader pattern of how narratives function in imperial contexts. We now turn to a different case, Crimea, a peninsula on the northern coast of the Black Sea, shaped by overlapping empires and cultural traditions. While the context and historical setting are different, it raises a similar question about how power and meaning are formed through narrative. Crimea isn't a rising empire. It is a contested cultural landscape shaped by many people and historical happenings. Here, meaning is also formed through literary texts and cultural memory. To understand this better, we turn to someone who studies the Ukrainian cultural narrative of Crimea. We asked literary scholar Larissa Cybenko how Crimea appears in narratives and how poetry shapes identity. She approaches Crimea not through geopolitics, but through geopoetics, focusing on landscape, memory, and literary imagination rather than borders or political power alone.
I have known Crimea since my student days, and it was one of my favorite places. Not only for me, but for many people in the Soviet Union who want to see and experience something different. Because Crimea was always a completely different world, also in terms of nature, with its dry subtropics and all the vegetation. But also because there was always this feeling of freedom in Crimea, because it is a peninsula in the Black Sea, and the sea looks endless there. There is absolutely nothing to disturb the view. No islands, just a few ships in the distance now and then, of course. And you have this feeling of freedom there. And, of course, that is the landscape of inspiration and the proof of creation, the work of many authors. In the 19th century, many Russian authors were in Crimea, and this was already emphasized in Russian literary history, in Soviet literary history. There have been many anthologies and theoretical works on this, but as far as the culture of other people is concerned, Crimea has always been multicultural. And of course, there were narratives of other peoples. So all of that was not taken into account. It was suppressed, it was erased, not mentioned. And of course, in today's situation, it would be important to show how Crimea is presented in Ukrainian consciousness. That is, what connection Ukrainians actually have to Crimea in spiritual terms.
She explains that Crimea has long been a multi-ethnic and multilingual space where different cultural perspectives coexist and compete. The peninsula has been a meeting point for many people and cultures over centuries. Its location between Europe and Asia, and between settled and nomadic worlds, made Crimea a place of trade, migration and cultural exchange. Over times it was influenced by different empires, but always kept its cultural diversity.
Already during the Romantic period, especially this larger part of Ukraine, the center and east, was under the power of the Russian Tsars. It was already part of the Russian Empire. And some, such as Nikolai Gogol, switched to the Russian language because it gave them prospects. But there were also authors, such as Taras Shevchenko, who wrote in Ukrainian. In the works of Shevchenko, but also in Gogol, there are these motives about the Ukrainian Cossacks and their heroic acts, this glorious past. In the 19th century, however, the Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians attained almost equal social status within the Tsarist Empire. So they were colonized from the center, and there are certain similarities. And this is already reflected in the texts of Ukrainian authors of the last decades of the 19th century.
The landscapes are often the same: the mountains, the sea, the light. These images appear in Ukrainian as well as Russian literature, but shared images do not mean shared meanings.
In the 19th century, Crimea was an exotic region for Russians, practically a travel destination. There are these rather touristy nuances. For example, one of Pushkin's most famous poems, these trick fountains of Bakhchisarai. He describes these water features, how interesting they seem, how exotic they look. And he mentions this beloved woman of Khan, the Polish slave girl. There is also the same motif, but among Ukrainian authors, such as Larissa Cybenko. She also describes Bakhchisarai, and she also mentions this story, this love story, and she sees this fountain of Bakhchisarai, but for her, something else comes to the foreground. It is the ruins of the glorious past of the Crimean Tatars, and not just the story of this unfortunate Maria.
In Ukrainian literature, Crimea often appears as a space of beauty and imagination. Moreover, an important feature that contributes to the peninsula's multi-perspective cultural history are Ukrainian-Crimean Tatar relations, cultural exchange and female perspectives, and the geopoetic representation of Crimea. What emerges is not a single story of Crimea, but multiple narratives shaped by history, culture, and perspective. And that's the power of narrative. Cybenko shows that even when literary motifs overlap, they do not produce a single shared story, but different cultural meanings shaped by history and perspective.
I think we should do research about Crimea and also highlight Ukraine's cultural and spiritual connections to Crimea. In the past, also in the 19th century, during the Russian Empire and during the Soviet Union, only the Russian-centric perspectives dominated. Even when anthologies and texts about Crimea were published, practically no Ukrainian authors could be found. I think it is also important to show that cultural life in Ukraine had and has a direct connection to Crimea.
Kulturleben in der Ukraine auch direkten Bezug zur Krim hatte und hat.
At first glance, Japan and Crimea couldn't be further apart. They both appear in very different historical and geographical contexts. In Christine Frank's research, European newspapers show how the image of Japan changed over time in response to political and military developments, especially during Japan's modernization and expansion. Larissa Cybenko's work on Crimea focuses on literary texts, where the peninsula is shaped through recurring images, narrative and memories, and by that it becomes a place of yearning shaped by different cultural and historical narratives. Taken together, these two cases show how meaning is produced in different media, newspapers in one case, poetry in the other, and how historical context influences the way places are described and understood. Looking at Japan, Crimea side by side makes one thing clear. Whether we read newspapers or poetry, meaning does not exist on its own. It is shaped by how texts are framed, contextualized and addressed to an audience. That's also what Christine Frank points out.
Literature is always connected to history. You cannot read a book without having history in mind. But what we are doing is reading closely, reading very, very carefully, contextual reading, taking not only the news as data, but see how is this being presented, what was the framing of the news. So through my studies, I can teach especially students to look carefully at newspaper, to look carefully at media, to ask for the conditions, who is talking, what is being highlighted, what is the aim, what is the intended public of this news, and so on. Critical reading of news is very important, and we can do this with this historical material, I think, in a very excellent way.
What these perspectives show is the importance of careful contextual reading. Historical newspapers and literary texts do not simply reflect reality, they present it in specific ways. Understanding how these narratives are formed helps us read both past and present more critically. Thank you for watching. If you want to explore more about how stories shape Eurasia, subscribe to the channel and join us on the next episode of Eurasian Transformations.